And we are live on YouTube. And I'm going to let everybody in. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Takes a couple of minutes to let everybody in the door, but welcome to those of you who are joining us. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Takes a couple of minutes on Zoom to let everybody in. Please be patient, but we'll be with you shortly. We'll get started in just a minute, everybody. Good evening. We'll give it another 30 seconds, and then we'll get going. All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Losak. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. With me are Renters Alliance staff members, Director of Outreach, David Mullins, Pat Beckham, Tim Wong, and Malek Demir. And our special guests, of course, Nicole Katravanos, the manager of the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, and the director of the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, Scott Bruton. A couple of things. We would like you all to pay attention to the regulatory areas that we sent you in the newsletter, and I think I just sent it to everybody in email, so that you can have some thoughts on that and provide comments, concerns, questions to the director and to Ms. Katravanos. Hang on one sec. I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of a meeting. Can I call you back? Okay. That's the problem of being live, but we're used to it. Saturday Night Live, but this is Thursday. So please put your questions or concerns in the chat. Our staff will be monitoring that to see what your questions and concerns are. We want to make sure that as much as we are explaining what's going on, the director would like this to be a listening session. So it's his opportunity to get your input on these regulatory areas of the rent stabilization bill. A couple of historical things. The Renters Alliance has been pushing for rent stabilization since we were formed in 2010. It has been a long and difficult process, changing attitudes and culture, awaiting for a council that was a majority in support and a county executive who was also in support. So it has been quite a long slog. We got there not alone. We got there with friends and allies and hundreds, if not thousands, of renters who spoke to this issue. other prominent groups throughout Montgomery County, from labor unions to civic organizations, religious organizations, that spoke up in favor of this legislation. The eloquence of the new housing director, whose expertise in this area was noticed and appreciated by the council, that alleviated many of the common concerns about imposing a rent stabilization program. That said, the law itself is still not everything that we wanted. It still would limit rent increases to 6% or less, and it still is not in effect. It was enacted on July 18th. All legislation in Montgomery County takes 90 days before it comes into effect. This particular legislation not only has the 90 days, but also has a series of regulatory issues that need to be resolved and approved by the council before the whole legislation takes effect. So the regulation areas are very important. And the Renters Alliance is deeply concerned that if we don't pay attention to it, and if the regulations aren't developed appropriately, that it could weaken the legislation. So we are particularly grateful to the director and his staff for providing an opportunity for all of us to comment and hear his thinking as he develops these regulations, which will ultimately, again, go to the council for approval. We're also going to be joined by the lead sponsor for this legislation, Councilmember Will Juando, whose staff Hugo Cantu is holding the position for him when he can pop on, and we'll get some remarks from him when he's able to join us. But for now, I'll turn it over to Director Scott Bruton to give his remarks and ask questions, and hopefully Nicole Catravanos can chime in as necessary as someone who is also going to be helping to develop those regulations, and of course is head of the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs for later in the program if you all have any questions or concerns in general as renters facing issues in your apartment communities. So again, welcome to everybody. A special welcome to the Director of Department of Housing and Community Affairs, Scott Bruton. Scott?
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me on. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. Look forward to getting your feedback. I've been doing a series of listening sessions with stakeholder groups who have an interest in the rent stabilization law. So that includes not only the kind of coalition of advocates for rent stabilization, but also the professional associations representing the realtors, landlords, builders and developers to get their perspectives as well. I think this is maybe my 5th or 6th, and a few more to go on top of this. We're going to be meeting, for example, and doing a listening session in October with the folks from the Commission on Landlord and Tenant Affairs, because they had some perspective that they wanted to share with us. So what I've been doing with these listening sessions is starting off with going over the process of what's going to happen between now and when the rent stabilization law becomes, what's the right word, enforced, between now and when we start enforcing the rent stabilization law. And everybody's been very focused and asking us, when are the regulations coming? When's the time? What's the timeline for the regulations? And I've made sure to tell everybody that the regulations are just one aspect of getting to the point of enforcing the new law. There are also, and I'll go in with each of these in turn. So regulations, that's important. We also have to pass a supplemental bill, which will give the council to pass a supplemental bill that will give us funding to hire new staff for the positions to implement and administer the law, but then also startup funding for the computers they'll need, for coding for the database that we're going to need to work on. So then once the supplemental is done and we have the funding in place, we're going to have to work through the Human Resources Department for the county to create the 9 new jobs that are going to be needed to implement and administer the law. And so there's the creation, then the advertisement for their recruitment, interviews, and finally getting people on staff and then getting them trained up. We also will have to develop policies and procedures for dealing with a wide range of things taken care of in the regulations, regulation of fees, housing provider petitions dealing with fair return and capital improvement and substantial rehabilitation. So all a long way of saying that we're cooking many different things that take different prep time and different time to cook or bake. And we have to have it all put onto the table at the same time, hot for everybody to enjoy or partake in. And if we were, for example, to prepare the regulations, get the council to pass them, and then the regulations started to be enforced, or we were able to start enforcing the regulations, and we didn't have the money to hire staff, we didn't have staff on board, we didn't have policies and procedures, and we didn't have a database system and portal for landlords and tenants to register certain things and apply for certain things online, then it would cause chaos and we wouldn't be able to effectively actually implement the law. So that's the kind of range of activities, and I'm happy to go into any of them if you'd like. So what we've been doing with the listening session is there, like I said, there's a range of different things. Like Matt said, there are a range of different things that are considered in the rent stabilization legislation beyond just the standard limit on annual increases. And so what we've been doing with the stakeholder groups is asking for you all to give us questions. We may be able to answer some of them. Many we won't be able to answer with specifics because we haven't developed the regulations yet. But we're very interested to know what things are of particular interest to us. And also, each of the stakeholder groups has a unique perspective based on their relationship to the law. And so we would like your insights or things that you would particularly like us to consider or that you're concerned about as we write regulations and develop policies and procedures to implement and enforce the law. So I'll kind of stop there. Matt, do you as the moderator have any follow-up questions for me about what I just said that I can answer before we move into?
Plenty. You don't have enough time for all my questions, but
I'll do my best.
I'll ask a few. One is, first of all, can you give a timeline, what you're thinking?
A total timeline? Well, the law, as you mentioned earlier, 90 days. And so I think it's October 26th. It's either October 26th or 25th, which is 90 days after the law was signed into effect by the county executive. And that is when the law will go into effect. Enforcement, though, won't start based on what's written in the law. Enforcement won't start until the regulations have been approved by the council. And so that involves us drafting them, working with stakeholders to get your feedback in case you have any insights that we might not have come up with ourselves, publishing in the county register for public comment. And then I'm sure the council will have lots of debate and suggestions about tweaks they want to make. So that's it. The ultimate deadline is, I can't remember, it might be April 25th, 26th, something like that, the different days that we have to really have this in place based on what the council had talked with us about, but we're trying to do it much more quickly than that. We're trying as best we can to front load work on the regulations while warning everybody that we are not going to be in any position to actually start enforcing them until we have those other pieces in place. Because if the landlord wanted to fill out a fair return petition and we didn't have a petition form, we didn't have standards for evaluating it, and most importantly, didn't have staff for evaluating the petition, it wouldn't really work. And so my goal is within the next 30 to 40 days to have a draft of the regulations. and then we will be getting feedback from the stakeholder groups as well as from the council. We will have to publish it in the register, and then the council will have to vote on it. And so realistically, I'm guessing that we're looking at sometime at the earliest late in 2023. And that could be drawn out depending on how much deliberation the council would want to go into. And also, it will depend on when we start enforcement. It will also depend on how quickly the council has passed the supplemental and how quickly the Human Resources Department has worked with us to create the positions, advertise them, and hire. And so it's a lot of stuff all to do at the same time. And not to mention that we're actively working with TEBS, which I can never remember what the acronym stands for, but it's our central tech and database folks for the county. And they're working with us to combine some existing databases and to develop a centralized portal for landlords and tenants to use to interact with the rent stabilization law, as well as, say, code enforcement and licensing. The reason for that is there are a lot of triggers in existing law, as well as the new rent stabilization law, about when you can increase rents. So if you're not licensed, you can't increase rent. You shouldn't even be charging rent if you're not licensed. If you have existing code violations on your unit, you're not allowed to increase rent under existing law. And so we want to save some time, to save some labor and cost for the county government. We're going to use our database to trigger some of this enforcement. So if a landlord goes in to try to register a new rent, but they haven't paid their licensing fee and they're unlicensed, or they're trying to raise rent on a unit that they have code violations on, the computer system, the database, and the portal won't let them do that until they've corrected those issues. That saves the tenant having to go and figure this all out and complain about it. It also saves a number of staff who would have to try to verify these things by checking every new rent increase to see if it fits with the licensing and code as well as other requirements.
Mr. Burton, some of the other questions would be, first of all, I imagine, since you've come to Montgomery County's Director of Housing with some expertise from Washington, D.C., that maybe some of these regulations are already developed by others that can be cannibalized and modified to fit Montgomery County. And the other is that can you concurrently begin hiring and with a later hiring start date so that these processes are running concurrently rather than consecutively? A lot of people are also concerned that even though the 90 days the law takes effect, but doesn't really become enforceable till after the regulations, but then people are seeing double-digit rent increases now. And will the regulations be able to be retroactive, at least to the 90-day period, on some of those increases?
So I'm not a lawyer. Nicole's a lawyer. I don't know if she wants to answer this question.
Boy, that's a supervisor's move, isn't it?
Yeah. To the best of my non-lawyer knowledge, we won't be able to retroactively prevent this. To retroactively regulate rents. And so until the law goes into enforcement, landlords are regulated under the current law, where they can, there are not limits, not statutory limits on how much they can increase the rent. There are some confusing gray areas given the language of the legislation, because the law goes into effect on October 26th. It won't be enforced until some rolling date when the regulations are finally done and everything's in place. But then we also have in law that you have to give a 90-day notice for a rent increase. And so how does a landlord give a 90-day notice for an increase, not knowing when exactly the law is going to go into effect? And so there are gray areas of confusion about this. We've been talking with the Office of the County Attorney as well as the attorneys for the council who helped write the law. Nicole, do you happen to remember the one sentence they gave us? I think I'll paraphrase and you tell me if I'm wrong. The sentence is, to try to answer that question, is the law goes into effect on October 26th and enforcement will begin when regulations are adopted. And so that's, it's clear as mud, but that's what the lawyers have given us. And, the best we can do based on, what's been written.
And obviously that's deeply concerning for many folks who've been working for a long time to get this bill enacted. Many people still believe that it is in fact in being enforced when it is not. We're trying to communicate that it has still got a long way to go, and that we are seeing significant rent increases. But I will say to everybody who's listening that if you have an excessive rent increase, and I'd say anything above 6% is excessive, that the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs wants to hear from you. Is that correct, Nicole?
Yes, we encourage everyone who has an excessive rent increase to file a petition with our office. We always reach out to the landlord, talk to the tenants to see what their situation is, and we try to mediate to reduce it. Obviously, there are no requirements at this time, but a lot of those initiatives have been fruitful.
Right, and we can also help with that as well. But one shouldn't just accept a rent increase as if there's no way to negotiate. There are ways to do that, and some of them could be excessive. Yes, Pat.
I was wondering if Scott could speak to, we're seeing a lot of tenants having increased fees for different amenities, for instance, parking going up. Are there any regulations about those?
There will be regulations. There are a couple of sentences, 2, maybe 3, that give us the authority to write regulations to regulate the fees that landlords charge tenants. It is the language for those sentences is doesn't go into a very specific detail, which is good in some ways and makes it more difficult than others. And so we have a broad mandate to regulate fees. And there are not a lot of examples of laws. I know Tacoma Park regulates fees to some degree, but as you know, probably in all kinds of industries, the vacation industry, as well as, the multifamily rental industry, fees have proliferated over the past decade or so, new and novel fees. So like an amenity fee. So like say you rent a hotel online and it's $275 a night, and then you get there, you stay your night, and you go to pay your bill, and the bill is $350, and there's a $75 amenity fee. Well, $75 amenity fee is just for the pleasure of staying there. And so the federal government, as well as local governments, have been passing laws to try to regulate fees that are not directly tied to a tangible benefit to the person paying for the service. And so we would be looking with the same kind of eye to regulate fees here, so that fees would not be used as a way to circumvent the standard limits on rent increases. And we'll also have to grapple with how to, so that deals with kind of new and novel fees, but also how do we deal with existing fees and what is a reasonable rate of increase? Because you mentioned a parking fee, but the parking fees have been going up significantly. And so a parking fee is not necessarily a new or novel fee, and you're actually theoretically getting something for it. But part of what we have to do is figure out what is a reasonable increase, or what is a reasonable rate to charge for parking. Do we set it as a percentage of your total rent? Do we have some other benchmark for doing that? And so some of the simplest requirements for regulations in the bill are going to be the most difficult for us to try to produce quality regulations on. But we think we're up to the challenge, and we'll do our best.
Well, it's always been our position that, once a fee is charged, particularly for parking, that the only increased cost to the landlord is maintenance of the parking situation. And so otherwise it's just profit. So we're not sure why anything would go up, except to say, over time, there are maintenance requirements for parking lots that require a certain amount of increase, that we need to, so we don't lose any money. But increasing fees in order to profit seems inappropriate and obviously a circumvention of the intention of the law. We are joined. Go ahead, Scott, please.
No, I was going to say, let's put a hold on that and move over to Councilmember Jawando.
Indeed, we're bringing in the ringer. It's my pleasure and always our honor to have with us Councilmember Will Jawando, who himself grew up in rental housing, knows what it's like, has been a champion for renters' rights and for this legislation from the beginning as its leading co-sponsor. Councilmember Jawando, we have been talking about the unfortunate timeline that goes with this. Director Bruton is talking about working as expeditiously as his department can, but obviously many renters are suffering right now. We are also concerned that the areas of regulation are subject to the council's approval, and we are concerned about the weakening of the intent of this legislation through any number of considerations in the regulation development, including the council's opposing whatever the director of housing recommends and delaying it further. So there's still a lot of room for people to pay attention and be concerned, even though we understand and are pleased that this is still progress and a step forward. So with that, Councilmember Jawando, welcome.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for having me and for all the advocacy of you and the Renters Alliance. And I see my good friend Pat and so many others on here in the DHCA team. Really appreciate all of you being here, and hopefully you met Hugo from my staff, who's been on and will be on, who's handling housing, who joined I think since we passed this legislation. So you're right, there's a lot of work to do, right? I always say justice requires vigilance. You can never rest on your laurels here, and it was a huge, monumental, historic step to pass permanent rent stabilization. We fought off a lot of, I worked really hard, and Scott was right there with me, and others fighting off a lot of weakening amendments, like a timeline and a phase out and a whole bunch of things. But we do have to come back and get past the regulations. Now, I'm hopeful, and I'm already talking to my colleagues about that look, the will of the council was heard. We passed this bill with the supermajority, and that the regulations should be consistent with the intent of the bill, of the legislation as passed. So this should not be seen as an opportunity to have another vote on the bill. And because our role, either in a method 2, this is a method 1 regulation, right? It's a method 2. Yeah, method 2. Our role is to, approve or disapprove. And obviously we can say why we're approving or disapproving, but, the Director Bruton and his team have been very helpful along this process of explaining what and why they're doing it. We gave them the authority because they have the expertise to promulgate the regulations on some of these items, like the fair return and like the fees, which are obviously really important. And we know that there will be bad actors that are trying to get around this law and raise rents as high as they can now and try to get around it with fees and other things. So that's why it's important we have these regulations. And while I wish we could have snapped our fingers and had it be in effect the day we passed it, there's just, there's a lot of work to do to get it right. And I know you all will spend time talking about that and will be engaged. I am pleased about the momentum that this has helped create around the state, though. There are others who are looking to pass permanent rent stabilization. And I think that will be a good thing for not only those jurisdictions, but also for Montgomery County, and just make the environment more settled. And if we can get multiple large jurisdictions to pass a permanent rent stabilization, that's effective and strong. And so, yeah, you're right. We will be vigilant, and we are talking, our teams are talking to Scott's teams and trying to make sure we're on the same page so that when it comes over, we can be effective partners in approving the regulation quickly. So with, the other thing I'd add, we do want to know, I see someone in the chat, and Hugo's chimed in right on time. We want to know the stories out there about what is happening, and what the increases are, and how, what's happening out there in the marketplace. I think that'll be important too, as we continue to have the both qualitative and quantitative data and an analysis around why this bill, why these regulations are necessary. And so to the extent that you can, I see Ellen in there. I'm sorry you got that large increase. But we have to humanize this and keep telling these stories, because that's the only way we're going to continue to move this forward. So I'm excited. I appreciate all the work that's been done, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. But just wanted to come by and say thank you for your advocacy.
Thank you, council member. I know that people will probably have afterthoughts, and you've got your email in the chat. I would also say, ask Director Bruton, is there a way for this listening session to go on in between listening sessions so that people have comments or concerns as they contemplate these regulations to contact you? Do you have an intake for that? How would you like the public to stay in touch so that you can keep listening?
Sorry, I didn't know if that was for me. I've been doing the listening sessions with advocacy groups or professional associations. And so what I've been asking those to do, so we don't get a flood of individual comments, to work with their particular organization or advocacy group to collate or condense, get consensus on what recommendations they want to make, what questions they have. And I've encouraged everybody after these listening sessions to provide notes to me on what their questions were, so that I know for sure that I've got it worded just how they want it, but also to augment those notes with any particulars they think of afterwards. And they're welcome through their representative to forward those on to me through the process. And as we're going through the drafting, we'll be circulating draft language on particular things to get feedback from the industry as well as advocates to different parts of this, because we figure it's better to work through the complex nature of some of these regulations in the drafting before we get to publishing in the register and getting the input from the council, to get the unique wisdom and knowledge that the different advocacy groups have.
Councilmember Joando, do you have any sense of the temperature with the council with regard to DHCA's request for funding for the staffing of this operation? Does that look okay, consistent with the intent of the bill?
Yeah, I think it's high. I mean, there's no, you always have to, again, with the big caveat, we always have to be vigilant. But as we discuss this, there is no way that DHCA is going to be able to do what we've asked them to do and what we want them to do, for example, in the area of troubled properties and keeping up with inspections and the like. So we understand that that's going to need to be built in. It was the discussion of staff and FTEs was built in to the fiscal note that came with the bill. And so that was always on the table. So yes, I think the worst thing you can do is pass something that can't be enforced. We have such a large, with almost 40% of the county renting, with all the rental stock that we have, they need more help, not less. So absolutely. And, but again, we just got to remain vigilant. But I think that intent will be there going into the budget season here. And I certainly will make sure that it's on the front burner.
Thank you. I know that you have multiple things that you're working on as we speak, but you know this, but I suppose we should say it for the record, but we are still seeing a Wild West out there with double-digit rent increases coming in. People are seeing increases in fees, and I'm quite sure that some of the less responsible landlords are still hard at work trying to figure out how to make as much money as possible before this legislation gets enforced. So again, we are deeply concerned about the development of these regulations and how soon it's going to take effect. But we thank you for your vigilance and leadership on this. And any final remarks?
No, thank you. And I share your concern, but also am thankful for your partnership. I think the way we do this appropriately is by moving expeditiously to get the regulations out, getting them passed, and then also just, again, chronicling and documenting these stories. And then there'll be a huge, and we still won't be done when the regulations are done, obviously, because again, as I've said, as a civil rights lawyer, a protection is only as good as the people who know they have it. And we're going to need to have multi-year robust outreach and engagement to make sure that people know that this is in place. And that started with the bill introduction and passage, but will continue for so that needs to be built into all of our processes. And I look forward to working with you all to get a good set of regulations, but also to make sure people know they have the help. And I'm glad Hugo put that in there. We have a work session on troubled properties, which is a related issue, on October 2nd at the Planning, Housing, Parks Committee that I'm on, which is obviously related to, and we were able to get in the legislation, which was really great, that if you are on the troubled property list, you can't come in and then ask for these, larger increases above what's required until you address the issues. So that's, again, something else that will be in regulation, but an important protection. So really, really appreciate you having me and look forward to working with you all going forward.
Thank you, Councilmember Jewell.
Thank you.
Oh, Matt, I didn't hear that. I don't know you. Is it just me, or is
Can
Matt,
you hear me?
There
Yeah,
you go.
no.
Hear you now.
Oh, sorry. Internet was unstable. Welcome to the world of where we live in. Director Bruton, you were saying when we were welcoming the council member.
You'll have to remind me where we were. I was paying close attention to him and forgot my point.
I think we were talking about fee increases, the length of time for some of these regulations. We also, I think we were talking about how people can access you when they have other comments, and we were talking about coming up through the groups rather than coming at you individually, which I get, but I do think some people might have expertise to share.
Sure. So, like you said, we're asking folks as much as possible to work through the groups that they're affiliated with, so that, folks may have many of the same questions or comments, and the groups can help to sort through them and to give us distilled versions of what folks are recommending and having questions about. Obviously, residents of the county are more than welcome to send in comments or questions, and we'll do our best to pay attention to those as well. But we really do appreciate the collective knowledge of the particular advocacy groups or professional associations in coming up with these things. And also, you know, for example, I'll mention the professional associations. Even though they may all be landlords or builders, they may have very different opinions within a range. And working through an association helps them kind of come to a consensus for what they think is important as compared to hundreds of landlords reaching out individually. And so I'm sure we'll have individuals as well, but from my own background, I found when folks work through you know, affinity groups or associations, advocacy groups, that really helps kind of focus people's intentions and efforts.
I just want to, for everybody, in case you haven't seen it, we put it out in our newsletter, and I did reach out to each of you individually. But the regulation areas are troubled or at-risk properties have to be, a regulation has to, for a unit located in a property designated by the department as troubled or at risk, must not increase rent or excess while it's still on the troubled properties list. And there's a lot of them on the troubled properties list, I've noticed. And so that's something to consider. Rent increases for vacant units, regulations must be issued to determine the allowable rent increase for a regulated unit previously vacant for more than 12 months with no active lease. So, you know, there is some concern historically that some properties might keep apartments vacant for some strategic reason to make a profit. And that's that down the road, or to circumvent the rent stabilization bill. So that could be a problem. Limited surcharges for capital improvements. So the director also has to develop regulations based on a petition by the landlord, whether or not the landlord can circumvent the rent stabilization because of capital improvements to the property. Now, some properties should have built into their budgets that they're going to maintain their properties and sometimes invest in their properties to keep up the quality of life and its value. And some of that is required in the code. But we want to make sure, obviously, that when a landlord does this and they just put a new rug in the front foyer, that's not an excuse to cause everybody's rent to go above the rent stabilization area. And perhaps even under consideration might be whether or not the tenants could also petition the Department of Housing and Community Affairs in opposition to that petition by the landlord, saying that they may be doing this, but they haven't done something else. And so there has to be a regulation that affords everybody an opportunity to petition when necessary. Fair rent return, fair return of rent increase. You know, the Renters Alliance has always taken the position, and we stake our credibility on it, that we understand that landlords are not in the charity business. There are some charity landlords out there, but they must make enough money to maintain their profit and keep up with legitimately related expenses to operating their business. We've always understood that. We don't think rents need to go up 6% in order to do that, but some of them certainly have a justification to maintain that profit margin. And if they can show that the rent stabilization law, and please, Director Bruton or Nicole, interrupt me if I get it wrong, but if they can demonstrate that the regulation does not allow them to keep up with that, maintaining that profit margin and legitimately related expenses, they could petition to say, hey, look, I've got to raise the rents more than that. Is that a fair assessment, Mr. Bruton?
That's correct.
Okay. There are, I'm not sure that I understand. I've never really understood. Maybe somebody else can explain it, Scott or Nicole. Apartment exemption for rent stabilization regulations must be developed to justify exempting units within a substantially renovated building. What does that mean?
So what that means, other jurisdictions that have rent stabilization would call that a substantial rehabilitation petition. In other jurisdictions, for example, I'll give you the example of the District of Columbia. In the District of Columbia, you could seek extraordinary rent increases for a substantial rehabilitation petition, if you spend more than half the value of the property on renovations. I think, pardon my memory, I think the council set that at 40% valuation. We have to come up with how one values the property, but 40%. And instead of, in the Montgomery County law, instead of being able to request extraordinary rent increases based on the value of the money put into rehabilitation, if you exceed 40% of the value of the property in renovations, you will be able to get a new 23-year exemption from rent stabilization. Now, that said, 40% of the value of the property is pretty much a gut rehab of a property. And so it is quite significant.
Okay, but what's the issue of the unit within the building?
Oh, I'd have to read, you want to read that again?
Yeah, it says regulations must be developed to justify exempting units within a substantially renovated building. Does that mean all of the units as you're talking about, or a unit within the building?
Again, not a lawyer, but my interpretation is that this is a building-wide
Okay,
issue, not
Okay.
substantially renovating one unit and getting like free from rent stabilization for one unit for 23
that's
years.
the confusion for me. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. We did talk about regulations for fees, and this is a common concern for everybody, from parking to amenities to a concierge fee or some other fee. We are deeply concerned about folks who are seeing fees added on that did not exist before. Please let us know. If it wasn't in your lease to begin with, it may not be a legal fee. The same thing with application fees, Nicole. There are limits on what fees can be charged at the outset. Is that correct, of a tenancy?
There are a number of different fee regulations that currently exist, including application fee, including pet
You
deposit,
froze up. Or I froze up. There you go. I can hear you now.
application fee, and pet deposit fees. We are encouraging tenants to file complaints if they are receiving new fees or if their fees are enhancing significantly, so we can assess them. And based on the current legislation, we would take a position on whether it's a lawful fee, a regulated fee or not, or if it's a law, and it's essentially an increase of rent, and if that fee should be incorporated through an increase of rent and a rent increase notice.
Nicole, we had someone in the chat that said they were being charged a $25 maintenance fee anytime maintenance was called.
And that's a new one.
That's a new one, okay. So they need to file a complaint
Yes,
with landlord
please.
tenant, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you.
By the way, speaking of fees, we've also seen fees where they are charging $50 when a check bounces, or some other fee when a check bounces. In the past, when we've seen that, landlord tenant took the position that unless the landlord could show that there was a cost to the landlord for the check bouncing, that the fee was just an arbitrary fee that could not be enforced.
It also depends if it was in the lease, right?
Well, if the lease says, look, we're going to charge you $100 every time you bounce the check, I'm not sure that that's the operating principle of not charging a fee unless the landlord incurs the expense. So, for example, if you have 24-hour concierge and you have you're locked out of your apartment and they hand you the key to go up and let yourself in, but they're going to charge you $100 every time you lock yourself out, that is not a fee that we understand that they can charge or that is lawful, because there's no expense to the landlord. If it's at 3 o'clock in the morning and they have to call in a maintenance guy, they could say, hey, listen, it takes him 2 hours. We're going to charge you 2 hours of that maintenance man's hourly wage. or some other reasonable related fee because of an expense that's incurred to the landlord. So have you thought about that, or we're just looking at ways in which people tack on fees that don't seem justified based on the principle of no incurred cost to the landlord?
I mean, I haven't seen that in a lease, and if you have seen that in a lease, please bring it to my attention.
Okay. Good. And the annual reporting, which of course has been very interesting and important for the Renters Alliance. Not only do we want to see regulations must be developed to specify reporting on regulated rental units, rents, and notices of increase, but we're also hoping to see a greater drill down on why people are moving, and some kind of information. Why did they move? Was it because of breach of lease? Was it failure to pay rent? Did they receive a notice to vacate? Or some other information to get a holistic view of housing stability in Montgomery County. We've talked about that a bit. Mr. Bruton, any comment?
I would say that would be extremely difficult to do accurately. You could ask the question, but the landlord may have no notion of why the tenant left, and so might not fill it out or fill it out with a guess that would be inaccurate. Also, the landlord may choose, I think it would be, in the words of one of the data analysts at the county staff, it would be of little analytical value because it would be extremely difficult to validate the accuracy of what would be filled out in the survey.
Well, the survey as we know it now is still a required survey according to the licensing, I think, in Montgomery County. And so to add to the licensing that, maybe you can't tell why the person moved out, but you can tell if they moved out based on a notice to vacate issued by the landlord, or if they were given a court summons or some other action by the landlord that the landlord knows about. I think that could be captured if required. But if the person just moves out because they want to move to Arizona, although I don't know why at 120-degree temperature, but if they wanted to, that perhaps could not be captured in a survey like this. So you could have an unknown checkbox, I suppose.
Yeah, but an unknown checkbox would be of little, again, if you have survey results that have little or no validity or accuracy to count on for analysis, then they are of little use in making any kind of point. And so, for example, if someone wanted to, an outside organization wanted to try to get records from the court on the number of eviction filings and compare that to the number of evictions that actually were scheduled and took place. Something like that could be done by an outside organization, not necessarily something that we have the staffing capacity to do. But there, are other ways to get at it, to get at the issue for why people left, and was it through the eviction process or through the threat of eviction that would be more accurate and useful to try to make points in changing policy or budgets.
Well, that is something for a future discussion, but it's always been our concern that the only data we have is the eviction data coming out of the court, and yet we don't know how many people, quote, self-evict from threats by landlords who don't know. It helps us to know how many people don't know their rights and move because they think that they get a notice from a landlord's attorney saying you've got to be out in 10 days, and not knowing that that notice has no force in the law until they go to court. So it's an area that informs us on the degree of unstable housing, which we think that there's a whole hidden instability out there that we would like to assess somehow. And I'm all ears about your expertise on how we might find that out. The court's information is very limited.
That, I mean, honestly, I absolutely agree with you that it would be wonderful to have that information. But at the same time, like I've been saying, it's not worth it to go through exercises that aren't going to get you the information. During the pandemic, I had multiple colleagues who were national experts on the eviction process and who were working on things in DC. And it was a huge lift trying to get the DC courts to provide additional information. And we don't necessarily, have sway or jurisdiction to get the courts to, the courts are pretty independent as far as what they're willing to give up. And it usually takes lots of negotiations to get at getting that data. And many times the courts don't have the staff or the database or the ability through their databases to track these things and turn them over. So it is I agree with you, is it a very worthwhile, it's very worthwhile information to have, but a very difficult nut to crack to get it.
I wonder if the landlord might have to file with you all by licensing requirement any notice to vacate or to list that in some way. But anyway, a topic for future discussion. But the regulatory area, I guess why it's pertinent is because this is an opportunity for the development of reporting, which has been near and dear to us for some time. For historical context, when the Renters Alliance was before the Renters Alliance, when we had the Tenants Work Group from 2008 to 2010, the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, well before the leadership of Scott Bruton and Nicole Gatravanos, but there was basically a very simple survey that went out that overly aggregated information and things looked very rosy. And it was not really a scientific survey. And we have moved in a direction of drilling down to gather more information. And obviously we all agree that accurate and holistic information is valuable in policymaking. And so we're hoping, since we have another bite at this apple, to consider how we can get as much information as possible to keep everybody informed and keep, knocking down these rumors about what the housing situation looks like, but basing it on data and accuracy. Staff folks, do we have any questions from our folks or concerns that we can address with Mr. Bruton on the subject of the rent stabilization bill and its regulations?
I think you pretty nailed it. Pretty much nailed it. Yeah. See anything
All
for
right.
Mr. Bruton.
All right. Then I'd like to remind everybody, if you have questions or concerns on the regulations, which are in our newsletter and was sent out to everybody who registered for tonight's town hall, to send them your concerns, questions to us at info@rentersalliance.org, so we can do as Mr. Bruton requests and collate and synthesize these recommendations to give to the department. We ask you to do it soon. Consider it in the next week or two so that the department can in turn consider it. Mr. Bruton, any final remarks on where you're moving with this regulation process?
If y'all are religious, pray for us. It is a lot of work to do in addition to the work we have, but it's worthwhile, and we'll do our best. Like I said, we very much value the point of view of stakeholders in providing your insights, your wisdom gathered over many years of working in whichever area that you do. We're going to do our best. But I know what I was going to say. We're also going to be reaching out to some national experts for example, National Housing Law Center has some folks who've done some work on fees and regulating fees. The White House wrote a short white paper on the notion of junk fees and things. And so I'm going to be doing my best to use my connections as well as my connections to try to get us some, because I never believe that I, no matter what my expertise, that I know everything and, can find out everything. And so we'll be trying to look to a lot of, for a lot of perspectives in this and do our best to, set up maybe some national standards for others who want to follow after us. And I know there are other jurisdictions in Maryland who will hopefully be following on after us, and whatever we can do to provide some guidance that they can, use as they go through the same process that we're going through, we hope to provide.
Well, if whatever wisdom I have is not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There's probably no way to make this thing perfect, but there are rent stabilization programs out there that are in effect. They are imperfect, but they do the job. And Lord knows our residents need that law enforced as soon as possible. So again, we thank you for joining us. We know you're hopping off yet to another meeting. So we are grateful for your attendance. Ms. Katravanos, if you could stay for a little while longer, just to make sure we give the tenants an opportunity to ask questions of landlord and tenants affairs, and for you to give us a little update on anything that you're seeing out there. So Scott, you're welcome to stay as long as you like, but I know you're busy.
Now I got to go. Thank you all for having me. Oh, and make sure to ask Nicole about her new online complaint form. It's
Ooh.
very exciting.
Yes. It excites many people.
It does. Bye-bye, y'all.
Take care. Thank you, Mr. Bruton.
Bye.
Nicole, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. As our DHCA director was mentioning, we now have a live Ulta complaint form. So landlords and tenants can file the complaint directly online to our office. Like all technology things, there have been a few hiccups along the way, but we are smoothing them out. Every single day I'm talking to IT to see how we can make that process better for users and minimize user error as well. So please, if you have any questions regarding your rights, regarding the obligations of landlords, please reach out to us first before you file a complaint. You can email us at ulta.intake@montgomerycountymd.gov, or you can call via 311 and leave a message with the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs. We have an exceptionally high rate of return. We call within 24 to 48 hours, and then you can have a one-on-one phone call with one of our well-versed investigators. All my investigators have an aggregate of over 80 years of landlord-tenant experience. So I know that sometimes I come to the space and I speak, and then afterwards people want to speak directly with me. And when I can, I do try to reach back out. But please know that you are in good hands with Ulta investigators, because they have been doing this for years and are very well versed with the nuances of the law, the nuances of the fact patterns, and the commonalities between different tenant experiences. And just a reminder as well, if you're having any type of maintenance issue, always you can file a complaint with code enforcement via 311 as well. You can do it over the phone or you can do it online. And they also have a quick turnaround on an inspector coming out to do the initial inspection.
And of course, Nicole, you want them to go to their property manager or landlord first.
Absolutely, before filing a complaint. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, if it's a landlord-tenant dispute, feel free to contact us first so that you know what your rights are, know what their obligations are, so you can speak to your manager in an informed manner, right? But before filing a complaint, we always highly recommend that you try directly to communicate with your property manager or owner to resolve the dispute. Mm-hmm.
Right. It's just not fair to hammer them if they haven't had an opportunity to cure it first. But we also know that sometimes property managers and landlords are not responsive, and there is a law that sometimes requires them to be responsive. So we encourage that process. Nicole, I'll put you on the spot. I just want to ask a couple of basic rights since we are working to organize tenants associations all around the county. But what is the law regarding tenants' rights to use facilities on properties?
So Chapter 29 has an entire section regarding the rights of tenants to organize. And some of the language there is very specific, and the one that isn't, we are supposed to interpret it with the intent of the law. When it comes specifically to meeting areas, property managers have to allow the tenant association to use a common space. And the first meeting of the month, I believe, cannot be charged. It must be free. However, if there is more than one meeting a month, or for other reasons that they want to use the space, and if there is a fee associated with that space, then that fee can be charged. So as all of you know, Renters Alliance is well known for helping tenants form tenants associations, and I think every tenant is always going to be strengthened by having a tenant association. And I highly recommend that you reach out to Renters Alliance if you're interested or motivated in organizing members in your community.
Yeah, and thank you, Nicole. That law, by the way, which is 29-33, which explains the general rights of tenants, was modified with our leadership back in 2015. It used to be that tenants always had a right to use the community facilities in the building, but they could be charged for it, which became prohibitive for most communities to be charged $150, $200, $300 an hour to use the community space on the property. We changed the law with the leadership of County Executive Mark Elrich, who was on the council at the time, Bill 1915, that allows for tenants to use the space on the property, provided there's not a justifiable reason that it's in another event going on or something else that the management reasonably can tell you, but to schedule an event at no charge once a month for tenants meetings or tenant association development meetings, or just a group of tenants who want to talk about issues in the building. So you get that, once a month. It's very important, and we will help you to do that. Working collectively in your community is a lot easier than working one at a time with a landlord if you've got issues. And of course, it's also a theme of the Renters Alliance to build community. So it's not just about complaints, though that's important. It's also about quality of life, knowing your neighbors, welcoming new neighbors, and being active in your community, inviting experts in to talk about issues of importance to you, elected officials to ask them questions and hold them accountable, and to hear your views, but to be active citizens. Just because you're a renter doesn't mean that you're any less of a citizen than anybody else who owns a home in our community. So building community is a good way for a tenants association to be active. Anything else, Nicole? What are you seeing out there? Anything that's coming to mind that you want to remind tenants in general?
Just the importance that when you're in the process of moving out, to always request an inspection in advance, to request it in writing at least 2 weeks in advance, and it's required for a landlord or the management company to walk through the space with you, so that there aren't any surprises down the road as far as the condition of the unit and how it was left, and then deposit being credited as a result of it. So if you're in the process of moving out or expecting to move out, please reach out to us. We can walk you through to make sure you're providing your notice of non-renewal correctly, to make sure that you're requesting your inspection, to prevent any issues down the road.
I want to address a quick question.
Nicole.
So go ahead, Pat.
Oh, I'm sorry. We have again in the chat, one of the viewers want to know, can you make a complaint anonymously? Because she, as well as myself, have always heard that tenants are very afraid to make complaints, so they don't. So,
So if you can make 311 complaints anonymously, which mean we're 311 code enforcement complaints that have to do with maintenance anonymously. But if it has to do with your specific unit, then it'd be pretty obvious that it's someone from the unit that's conducting the complaint. As far as landlord tenant, you can call, you can email us without providing your personal information to get anonymous information. But if you want to file a complaint, that's all public information, just as if you file a case in court. It can't be shielded. It can't be anonymous. Now, we've talked about retaliation laws. The law limits. There is protection for tenants when it comes to retaliation, and I can go through that, but it's also limited. So it's understandable that there is this real fear. And what I recommend that you do is, especially if the issue that you're having is something that's building-wide, tenant-wide, institutional, that you reach out and you communicate with us to what's going on. And if you can provide documentation to prove the allegation, there is a possibility that instead of your name being on the complaint, that the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs could open a complaint against the landlord or against the property. But there still would need to be some communication. There would need to be some documentation. I would be able to open what we call an administrative case just based on allegation or based on one person's testimony of an unlawful action.
okay, thanks.
I want to, I saw Ellen Cohen's question in the chat, and Nicole back me up on this, but the legislation has not taken effect yet. It requires 90 days after the signature of the county executive, which I think was July 24th, something like that. It doesn't take effect until late October. I believe Director Bruton said October 26th, but understand that even though the law, quote, takes effect, it has not taken, in this case, it will not take effect until the regulations are developed and approved by the council. So that's going to take several months more.
Challenge is that we're using the word effect, or when is it going to be in effect? And people are confused because they're hearing effective date of 10 and then October, and then they're saying, but the regulations need to be passed.
Right.
So the word that I like to use is, when will the bill be implemented? When will you have a right under the bill? And that will happen after the regulations are approved by council and after they've been published for 1 month.
And according to Director Bruton, we are looking at a target date. That's not guaranteed. A target date of sometime April 2024. So that's what he said. But that's what he said. But exactly the point, though, Nicole. We don't know. We do know that it's going to take several months and it's going to be into 2024. So you're going to have to stay tuned. There is no organization more interested in this being enacted than we are, and we will let enacted and implemented than we are, and we will let you know as soon as we know, but it's going to have to be tracked.
To let everybody know, I'm working on a page. It's going to be an FAQ page for the Rent Stabilization Office. I hope to have it open in the next month. It's going to have FAQs for landlords. It's going to have FAQs for tenants. And my goal is to have a timeline on that webpage. And it will show you where we are in the process. And as things materialize, that timeline will be updated. So that is my goal. We're almost done with the FAQs. I expect within about a month or so, we can have that page up and going. And it can be a location that landlords and tenants can always go to see what updates have occurred in the regulation process and implementation of the bill process.
Thank you. Anything else? Pat, Tim, Malek, Hugo, anything else from you all or from our audience?
I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to Montgomery Renters Alliance, DHCA staff, everybody, renters that are interested, landlords that are on. It's after 5, so I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that's on and that continues to do this work. And I'm just honored to be a part of it and part of the council member's office. Thank you.
Well, and we're glad to have you and glad you're part of the council member's office. Nicole, we'll give you the last word.
Just to let you know that, Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs is always doing its best to provide the service to landlords, to tenants, to answer questions. Please utilize the Renters Alliance to update with what the situation currently is, any concerns that you may have, any changes in management procedures, so that we can make sure that we are responding to the needs of the community.
All right, with that, thank you to everybody. This was recorded on YouTube, so you can watch again. And if there's something that you missed, and you can share it with others, your neighbors, please share as much of this information as you can with people you know. You all can contact us again at info@rentersalliance.org. We are on the beat every day, working for renters' rights. So with that, thank you, everybody, and good night.